Lena Dunham, you're the writer-director of Catherine Called Birdy, the 13th century coming-of-age story based on the 1994 novel by Karen Cushman. What was your relationship to the book before making the film?
Great question. So I read this book for the first time when I was 10 years old in 1996. So I was about 2 years late to the party, but still fairly early. And from the minute I read it, I mean, I was a child who was very transported by novels, particularly historical fiction, like many kids. And from the moment I read it, I felt I had a special connection to the main character. She was bratty, but loving. She could be brave, but childlike. She was a character who felt like she completely resonated on my frequency. And so the book stayed very close to me. And when I started making films, it was one of the first films that I dreamed about making. And so I got the rights in 2013 and ended up, shooting the film 8 years later in 2021. And it was a journey to get there and to get people to understand just why it was so important to me, but we did.
Growing up with this book, is your relationship with it now, going into making the film, was that different than when you were experiencing it as a 10-year-old?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that was wonderful about the fact that I didn't get to make the movie when I was 23 was that as I grew, my empathy for the characters who, besides Birdie, grew. And so when I was young, it was like I completely associated myself with this lead who was struggling against the kind of morality of her time, struggling against the tropes of her day. And as I got older, I also started to feel empathy for everyone from, Morwenna, her babysitter, to her mother, who was dealing with the expectations around fertility, to her father, who was dealing with the kind of with his own masculinized version of these pressures. And growing up and into a world where I could understand these other characters certainly opened it all up for me in a new way.
And how different is the experience for you coming into adapting previous material as opposed to writing your own original screenplay?
Well, I think I chose this material because I felt such a deep reverence for it, which is wonderful, but can also make it challenging because you want to hold on to every aspect of the book that you love and you just can't. And so first I had to free myself from the idea that I was going to be able to keep every element of this novel alive and to recognize that I was going to have to make some very significant changes, and hoping that Karen, the author, would understand kind of the deep passion that I felt for her work, and that all these changes came from a desire to really hold on to the core spirit of what she'd made. But what I love about adapting, which is so different than writing stories that sort of come out of thin air, is I love that you can find ways to, through empathizing with these characters, hide bits of your own experience in these lives that are very different from your own. And I found that aspect of it incredible. And I also love the fact that when you do get lost or when you do get stuck, you have this roadmap of the book and what initially attracted you to the material.
Another thing that's different about this story, of course, is that it's set in 13th century England as opposed to your usual kind of contemporary American milieu. Like, how different was that as a writing experience?
I think the thing that was different about it was that what was joyfully different about it was the research that I got to do into this moment in history and what the day-to-day lives of people, particularly women, and the domestic life were like at this moment in history. And I loved being able to kind of luxuriate in the strange details of that time. And then there was also the element of this taking place almost 1,000 years ago, and certain aspects of it feeling incredibly timely. I mean, it was an unfortunate coincidence that, Roe was overturned just a month before the movie came out, and these issues of bodily autonomy and the bodily autonomy of, people with uteruses, the bodily autonomy of people who identify as women, this remains in some ways as charged an issue as it always did. And so I was very aware, even as I was depicting a time that felt very alien and far off in certain ways, that there were aspects of it that were unfortunately completely applicable to the current world.
There's also sort of like a hopefulness to that, in the sense that you're sort of going back almost 1,000 years, as you say, and finding this spirit in this character alive and well at the time. You're sort of going back in time to kind of find this modern feminist, empowering kind of figure.
Well, it's interesting because I think it's a bit of a misconception that we sometimes have that women and people who were marginalized just went along with that, as if that kind of those kind of historical pressures, that they buckled under those. And there have always been fighters, and there have always been people who have, and that's what keeps the world moving forward, is the people who recognize that the situation they find themselves in is essentially unjust. And so what I love about Birdy is that despite every element keeping her down, pushing her towards an arranged marriage, pushing her towards conforming to people's ideas of what a daughter and a wife should be at that point, she continues to buck against those trends, and she does it with humor, and she does it with style. And so that is, as you say, there's a hopefulness to that, and it's a wonderful character to get to embody as a writer.
And as you mentioned, feeling more empathy and connection to other characters in the stories as you've gotten older. And I think one of those characters where that comes out in is her father, Rallo, who's played by Andrew Scott, who at first could be just a complete kind of brutish, domineering person, but then you kind of get to know their own kind of struggles. Tell me about writing that character and casting Andrew Scott.
Well, I will say thank you for noticing that, because it's very much what Andrew and I were attempting to do. And Andrew had a huge impact on what that character became. In the novel, he is much more brutish. He has like a brief moment of redemption, but he really is this kind of like belching, farting, alcoholic disaster of a kind of overlord. And I think what Andrew and I talked about as I tried to coax him to do the film, because I'm just such a big fan and I knew he would do something wonderful with it, is we talked about this idea of what does it look like when history exerts its control on everyone. And it's not just women who suffer under patriarchy, and it's not just daughters. The same pressures the pressures he felt to provide for his family, to be the proper depiction of kind of a masculine leader, those would have those would be their own form of injustice. And what would it look like if we found the softer person underneath that, who really did love his child and really did love his wife, but was at a loss for how to engage and was afraid to push back. And so we talked a lot about that, and it really influenced this character and influenced the idea that he had a real sweetness and lightness to him, and a fear of stepping outside of the norm.
And being both a writer and director, is there one part of that process that you prefer? Do you consider yourself a writer at heart or a director at heart?
I think I will always consider myself a writer first. The reason I started directing was because I wanted to be able to protect my stories in a certain way, and I've come to love it. I love how directing is a continuation of the writing process. You get to color the world in through your work with your production designer, your work with your costume designer, and most especially through your dialogue with your actors. And then, of course, there's the incredible way that your use of the camera can change the way a scene registers. But for me, it all comes out of writing, and writing is when I feel safest. It's when I feel most creative, and it's when I feel most myself.
And you're nominated for a Gotham Award for your screenplay. What was that recognition like to get?
Well, I got about 5 missed calls from my manager. And he wrote, "Call me ASAP." I obviously thought something terrible had happened, because that's just my ingrained way of thinking from having grown up with a Jewish grandmother. So that was where my fear kicked in. And then, of course, when I got the call, it was incredibly special and meaningful. The Gothams were the first award that I was ever nominated for Tiny Furniture, which was a completely surreal experience where I actually did get to go with my mother and my Jewish grandmother, who is no longer with us. And so to go back there and be in that space again with this cast I love so much, and also to have had a long enough career to know that doesn't always happen, and to be recognized by your peers for something that's this meaningful. Of course, I tell people all the time that, young people, we don't do this for the awards and we don't do this for the recognition. If that's what you want, then definitely pick a different job. But when it does happen, it's a very special moment that should be savored. So I'm doing that.
Well, congratulations on that. Congratulations on the film in general. And thank you so much for talking with me about it.
It's a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much.